For this example, I want to discuss a feature called Text Wrap. The Text Wrap panel is found under the Window menu. You'll notice that about 3/4 of the way down, you'll find the Text Wrap feature. Please note, this menu is in alphabetical order. So there it is, Text Wrap. I'm going to go ahead and click on that and launch it. I'm going to move the Text Wrap panel over here to my right, and in a second we'll discuss what these different features are. Before I do that, I want to point out that these paragraphs are not formatted correctly. You can see that there's double pilcrows and there are hyphens set into the text. So please note that this text is set up only as an example and it is not formatted correctly. Okay, so I like to experiment or show examples using primitives. So I'm going to go ahead and draw 3 different primitives. I'm going to draw a rectangular shape, and I'm going to fill this with a color. I'm going to draw an elliptical shape, and I will also fill this with a color. And I'm going to draw a polygonal shape, fill that with an additional color, and last but not least, I'm also going to draw a custom shape. And I'm going to do this using the pen tool. I'm going to go ahead and draw it on my pasteboard. And this one I'm going to fill with red. Alright, so you can see that I have a rectangle, an ellipse, a poly, and a custom shape. Okay, so by default, you'll notice that if I move this box or any of these shapes over the text basically just stays in its place. Now, let's pretend that this box is a placeholder for an image. You can imagine that I have a photograph placed inside of this. Now, if I have a photograph and I want to include it within the document, how do I get the text to respond to it? Well, that's where Text Wrap comes into play. You'll notice that by default, the Text Wrap feature on this object says no Text Wrap. If I click on the icon to the right, it says that it's going to wrap to the bounding box. Now, for a rectangle, the bounding box and the edge are actually the same thing. They're the same size. So I'm going to go ahead and click on wrap around the bounding box, and you'll notice that the text now begins to respond to the position of this object while it sits over the typography. So if I move this out of the text, you'll notice that the text sits in its normal position, and if I move this object over the text, it begins to wrap. As the object consumes or takes up more space, you'll notice that it continues to push and distribute the text throughout the rest of the document. If I remove this or make it smaller, you'll notice that the text responds by retracting itself. Okay, so as you can see here, depending on the size of this box and how it's inserted into the text will push itself away from it and continue to thread throughout the various columns and pages. Now, an additional feature that Text Wrap has is what's referred to as offset. So offset is basically a padding around the object. Now, by default, the offset is locked on all 4 sides of the object. So you'll notice that currently there's a link icon activated. If I go ahead and click one of these up arrows, you'll notice that it increases by a 1/8 of an inch. Excuse me, a 1/16 of an inch. You'll notice that if I zoom in here, you can see that the padding has a visual aid. And as I increase the pad size, the visual aid grows, or if I decrease the pad size, it contracts. You'll notice that the text doesn't exactly move away perfectly from this edge. So there actually is somewhat of a little bit of a margin of error within this feature. So you have to be careful with how this padding is actually distributing the text. If you're paying close attention to alignment and text distribution. You can unlink the four sides and increase one side over the other. Now, this might be a beneficial feature because if I have an image that spans the column, and if the sides are locked, let's say I want to increase the pad above and below, if it's locked, it's also going to increase the pad on the left and the right. If I do this all at once, the image will actually begin to influence the column next to it. All right, so let's increase that size, and you're going to see that the text wrap is influencing the column next to it. Now, I may not want that to happen. More than likely, I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to make sure that all sides are not being affected at the same rate, and I'm going to remove the padding on the left and the right. I only want padding in this particular instance above and below the image. Generally speaking, a pad of about 0.1875 to 0.25 is going to be appropriate. You normally want a larger pad below the image, especially if you're going to place a caption in this negative space. So that's something that you want to consider. Do I need a larger space below my images if I want to introduce a padding there? So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with this ellipse. I'm going to drop the ellipse here in this paragraph, and I'm going to go ahead and select wrap around the bounding box. So you'll notice that the bounding box on the ellipse is also a square or rectangular-like shape. So the distribution follows the bounding box. What if you want the text wrap to follow the contours of the ellipse rather than the bounding box? What if you wanted to wrap around the edge shape? Well, if that's the case, you should use the following feature, which is called wrap around object shape. So if I click on that, you'll notice that the text wrap now follows the edge or the contour of the ellipse. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the padding. In this case, you'll notice that there's really only one variable. So it's basically the padding around the edge of the shape. Now, one of the things that you have to be concerned about here is that if you have text wrap around object, usually if it gets close to the left edge of the text box, it starts to break it in a really unusual way. It might render your text somewhat illegible or difficult to read. But you can see here that this particular feature, text wrap around object shape, follows the contours of the graphic. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing here with the polygon. So I'm going to place the polygon here and activate around the shape. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the padding. And you can see the visual aid follows the shape or contours of the object. Other text wrap features include jump object. So in this particular case, the padding will actually remove itself, or excuse me, the padding will increase and force any text that sits to the left or the right of the object within this column to disappear or move away from it. So you can see that it's basically activating it by clicking the jump object button. The other feature that we have is jump column. So if I select jump column on this ellipse, you'll notice that once the text hits the ellipse, it's going to disappear below it. If I move this object down, you'll notice that more text appears above it, but never below it. So once again, this is called jump to next column. Jump object, wrap around object shape, wrap around bounding box, or no text wrap. Now the last graphic that I drew is a custom shape. So you can see that this feature also works on a custom shape. So any vector shape that you create or any image that you place in InDesign, you can activate text wrap, which will create a dynamic relationship between the image and the text, moving the text away from the object and redistributing the text by threading it from one column to the next and one page to the next.